Cornwall used to have its own legal system. It was something called Stannery Law, and just to prove it, here's a really, really, really good book on the subject. Um, Stannery is a word that means to do with tin. So, as the name suggests, it was all to do with all the mineral mining down here. Although Cornwall wasn't just tin; they actually made almost as much money from copper mining, as evidenced here. This is actually an original ingot from one of the local mines, because I am that nerdy. Obviously, it needs cleaning up a little bit, but that is genuinely copper. They also used to mine uranium, but this was before they really knew what to do with it. So they used to use it to colour glass. If this was ultraviolet, if I had some ultraviolet lights, that'd be glowing really nicely. But there you go, like uranium glass wine glasses from the Cats Protection League charity shop. £3.50 the set, bargain. But yeah, it was quite an innovative system. Arguably, things like the concept of limited liability companies, which are now, how commerce is done around the world, they started in Stannery Law. Because prior to that, it was pretty much if you started a business, you were putting your own money in there. It's like how partnerships work today, and you were liable for everything. The Cornish went, well, I'm not really sure about that. We'd prefer to be not liable for anything. We'd like to keep the profits, but we'd like not to be liable for sort of any of the losses if it all goes horribly wrong. So they formed something called the cost book company. That's actually a prospectus for a cost book company for one down in a place called Wendron, where one of my favourite pubs used to be. No longer there now, very sad. But yeah, lots and lots of very innovative ideas. And one of which was called something called tin bounding. Now, the idea is that because copper was such tin and copper and everything was such a valuable strategic material, for the just economy of the company, for the economy of the country. The idea was that if somebody had copper on their land and they themselves weren't exploiting it, they weren't mining in it, anybody else could go in there and do it. And you had to put the landowner on notice. And the traditional way of doing that was to cut turf and then put mounds of turf around the area that you were going, we're coming in there to start mining it. And that's why it's called, tin bounding, because you're sort of bounding the land. The landowner had a relatively short time then to sort of zoom off and start doing it himself. It's like, oh, I've got 3 months, I'd better start doing this. But if he didn't do that, then the people who'd bounded, whether it was an individual or more often one of these cost book companies, they would just move in and start mining. It wasn't a complete free-for-all. You couldn't do it under somebody's house, you couldn't do it under somebody's garden. And the above ground workings couldn't take up more than 1/8 of the land that you'd gone onto. So, you couldn't sort of just like take over and dump everything on somebody's nice cow pasture or anything like that. And you also have to give the landowner 1/8 of all your income from the mining. But then you could do that for a year and a day. But after a year and a day, the landowner could go to the Stannery Court, because we had our own courts as well, and say, right, I'm going to start doing this myself. Can you boot them off? I'm going to, I will actually do it. Promise, honest. Although a lot of the time they were quite happy not to, because again, somebody else was coming in and doing all the hard work and taking all the risk, and they were going to get a share of the profits if it was, actually worked out. And all they were really giving up was, having a big scruffy like wheelhouse in the corner of their land. Although now, of course, they're really desirable. That's a traditional sort of Cornish symbol, isn't it? And people spend a fortune buying them and doing up and living in them. But why have I rambled on about tin bounding? Well, it's another Robertshaw's rambles. But it also, we've got all this oil licensing thing in the news, with Just Stop Oil and everything. So how would you do it today? If you're sort of going, right, well, oil is allegedly a valuable commodity. How do I go exploiting that? Well, this is all done, but it's all run by the Department for the Environment and Climate Change. And what they do is all oil and gas rights in UK territories vest in the Crown. So you might own the land, you might even own some of the mineral rights, although check your deeds, because quite often you'll find you don't. But any oil or gas under there, that belongs to the government. So what do they do with it? Well, they advertise every now and again. They have a round of advertising for licenses and say, right, here's a set of areas, either onshore or offshore, where we're going to start granting licenses, except for Northern Ireland, where it's a slightly different system. So if you've got any commentators, anybody out there from Northern Ireland who fancies drilling for oil, and let me know. I'll do a follow-up video. But yeah, you see these adverts, you go, right, I fancy either doing that onshore thing or that offshore thing. And you apply, through a portal system called LARI, which is the Licensing Application Repository System. And there's a fee to pay, perhaps unsurprisingly. But you basically say, right, here's my plan for doing this. Here's what I'm going to do. Here's how I'm going to do it. Here's, my track record of these sorts of things. Here's a sort of financial statement showing we're good for the money. And all your financial information you put in there, that is treated as confidential. They also look at your health and safety record, but only for the last 5 years, which seems like a bit of a loophole, and also your environmental policy. But this is very much your environmental policy in relation to how you are going to operate. What vehicles you're going to use, how you're going to get rid of any spoil or anything like that. It's not about the environmental impact of oil drilling generally, and we'll come on to that and the purpose of this video in a moment. But yeah, then the Secretary of State decides who gets the licenses. Now, these are just the licenses to exploit anything that's under there. This doesn't grant you the actual land. I mean, it's not as big a problem out in the North Sea, perhaps, but on the land, somebody owns that. So you have to do a deal with the person who owns the land and say, right, you're the landowner. I've got the license to come in here and check all your gas and oil. We might have to do a deal. And also you have to get the planning permission from the local council. It's like, right, I've now done a deal with the landowner. We're all really happy. Here's my plans. I need to build this huge mining operation. Can I have planning permission, please? So, there's all those sort of hurdles and hoops to jump through, and you pay an annual fee to the government for the license, which increases, every year, and it's all based. It's like a factor times how many acres they have granted you. But the Secretary of State can say things like, well, actually, I'm going to divide this land up. I'm going to split it up. I'm going to give it to you two companies, or I'm going to suggest you two companies work together. It has quite a big discretion. I mean, this is reviewable in the courts, but the idea is it's very like the philosophy behind tin bounding, which is we need to encourage people to do this, and if people aren't exploiting it, if you have a license and you're just not using it, there's a procedure to just take it off you. It's like, well, sorry, we're going to give it to somebody who's actually going to come in here. So just in case your plans for saving the environment was actually, I'll just apply for all the licenses, get them, and then just not to do it. Unfortunately, there is a way around that. But the reason I suggest, sort of want to do this video, firstly, I just want to plug, because I'm going to do a huge thing about Stanley Law at some stage, because I think it's really, really interesting. I think, it all ties in with sort of like history of Cornwall. And if nothing else, I can get some nice B-roll. But also I've been, chatting to the Just Stop Oil people after the previous video I put up. And obviously their point is that the granting of licenses is just per se illegal. So they're going to give me their arguments as to why they say that is, and we can have a look at that. But yeah, so this is a little bit of an intro, and I just thought you might, you all like legal stuff, so now you can go to people, did you know, like, this country used to have a thing called Stanley Law? And then when you can also add, and if you're in Cornwall, a lot of people would argue it still does.